Hi everyone, welcome to this series of lectures for Macroeconomics 2, where I will be discussing the chapters you have been receiving notes with, and I hope that you are well and everybody is okay. So in this chapter, I'll just start to give you a background, which we have already done in class, but just for the learning purposes, I hope that this will be a good building block for it. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to formally define the words such as output, inflation, and employment. So basically, we want you to understand the fundamentals, macroeconomics factors, i.e. output, inflation, and employment. Then we need to be able to show how we can look aggregate output both from a production side and from an income side. Look at inflation rate and unemployment rate and be able to define them and know actually what are the implications of them in the economy. We introduce the goal of macroeconomic policy and the need to make choices. We introduce three central concepts in macroeconomics: short run, medium run, and the long run. So when we want to measure GDP, we always, when we want to know how countries growing, we kind of want to know how to measure GDP. So the measure of aggregate output in the national income account is gross domestic product, i.e. GDP, which is all goods produced within a country, goods and services produced within a country in a specific period of time, right? So they must be final goods and services, by the way, right? So GDP then, so there are three ways to think about economic as GDP. You can think this GDP is the value of the final goods and services produced in an economic during a given period, right? So I give an example where firm 1 produce steels, employing workers and using machine, sell the steel for 100 rand to firm 2, which produces cars. Firm 1 pays it to the workers 80 rand and keep what remain 20 as profit. Firm 2 buys the steel and uses it together with workers and machine to produce cars. The revenue from the car sales is 210. Of the 210, 300 goes to pay steels and 70 goes to workers in the firm, leaving 40 in profit. What's GDP in this economy? So you should understand that GDP, then you must remove this. So you check the final thing, which is this, minus 100, minus all the wages, so the final good is what has been produced. So it should be what is the excess after you remove the inputs, right? Okay, so the right answer for the question above about the value of GDP is 210. This is because steel is an intermediate good. An intermediate good is a good used in production of another good. Some good can be both final goods and intermediate good at the same time. When sold directly the consumer to consumers, potatoes are final good. When used to produce chips, they are intermediate good. The above example suggests that adding up the production of final good is roughly the way we actually calculate GDP numbers, right? Then another way of looking at GDP is we can look GDP as a sum of value added in the economy during a given period. The value added by a firm in the production process is defined as the value of its production minus the value of an intermediate good it uses in production. This definition gives us a second way of thinking about GDP. Put together, the two definitions imply that the value of final good and services. The first definition of GDP can also be thought as the sum of the value added by all firms along the chain of production to those final good, and the second as the second definition of GDP, right? So GDP is a sum of income in the economy during a given period. Here we're looking at GDP from the income side. Before we were looking at GDP from the production side. So some of the revenue are collected by government in the form of taxes or salaries, indirect taxes. Some of the revenue goes to pay workers, i.e. labor income, and the rest of the revenue goes to firms, i.e. capital income. In summary, from the income side, value added is a sum of indirect taxes, labor income, and capital income. I will correct the mistype here and when I send the notes to you again. From the output side, GDP is equal to the value of the final good and services produced in the economy during a given period. So that's one important definition. From output side, GDP is the sum of the value added in the economy during a given period. From the income side, GDP is the sum of income in the economy during a given period. Nominal GDP is the sum of the quantities of final goods and services produced times their current price. So nominal GDP is when you are looking at goods in nominal value, like in cash value. While when you are looking in real GDP, you are looking on the in the real term, i.e. if I give you 100 rand, you don't really look at the 100 rand in cash value. You look on how much goods you can buy by 100 rand. That's when you talk about real GDP. So the price of good increase over time as well. Often we prefer to understand how GDP changes over time without increasing prices, i.e. we choose a base year and then we compare how has GDP changed over time. To eliminate the price effect, we use the real GDP, which is the sum of the quantities of final good times constant price. Make sure you understand how nominal GDP and real GDP are constructed. This is important. Then we talk about real output growth, which is given by current output minus previous output over previous output. If this ratio is positive, it implies that the economy is growing. If it's less than 0, it implies that there is recession. We only say that the economy is in recession if this is negative for at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Unemployment, then, we will discuss unemployment a lot later in chapter 8, but I just want you to know what is unemployment and how does it work. The unemployment rate is defined from the ratio of unemployed to the labor force, and they're expressed as a percentage. So you take unemployment, the number of unemployed people over the labor force times 100 should give you unemployment. So what's the labor force? It's defined as the sum of those employed and those unemployed. And B, only those looking for works are counted as unemployed. Those not working are counted as not in the labor force. When unemployment is very high, those with jobs give up jobs and such, those without jobs give up job search and therefore become categorized as discouraged workers. Later, we will discuss this more in chapter 6. If all workers without a job gave up looking, unemployment rate will equal 0. This will make unemployment rate a very poor indicator of what is happening in the labor market, right? Higher unemployment is associated with more workers dropping out of the economy. Equivalent higher unemployment rate is associated with a lower participation rate. We will discuss this again later, where participation rate is defined as the ratio of labor force to the total population of working age population. So this again, so your participation rate is your labor force over total population in a working age person, so of all working age people. Now, all these are in chapter 7, and we will discuss chapter 6 and 7. I think when you talk about labor market, you will find this in the medium run, right? Higher output growth is typically associated with a decrease in unemployment rate, and lower output growth is associated with an increase in unemployment rate. Higher output growth then implies higher employment growth as firms hire more workers to produce more. Higher unemployment on the other, higher employment growth on the other hand, it implies a decrease in employment rate. So that's Okun's law. So later, in first year, we discuss about Okun's law. We will talk more about Okun's law in chapter 8 and chapter 9 as well. Higher output growth, it implies lower unemployment rate. Lower output growth implies higher unemployment rate. So social implication of unemployment is that unemployment actually affects human dignity. It affects human capital. Like there is erosion of human capital if you stay longer with a skill without being hired, right? Okay, so the inflation rate. Inflation, on the other hand, is a sustained rise in general level of price, levels of price, the price levels, right? So the inflation rate is the rate at which the price level increases. Read the book titled Extreme Money. You will actually see this. This is an interesting read. You should spend time if you get time, right? The rate of inflation is actually how we get it, is current price minus previous prices over previous prices. We often either use GDP deflator or consumer price index to measure inflation. The GDP deflator is defined as the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP and is given as the average price of the final goods and services included in GDP. GDP deflator is actually nominal GDP over real GDP. You get that, right? So CPI. Often consumers care about the average price of goods they consume. So CPI and GDP deflator need not be the same. After all, goods produced in the economy is not the same as the set of goods brought by the typical consumer. So what a country produces, not necessarily what a typical household buy. So if you're talking about a GDP deflator, you're referring to a country production because you calculate that in terms of GDP. But if you're talking about CPI, we calculate that as a basket of goods typical household purchase. So CPI and GDP are not necessarily always the same. CPI gives the cost and run of a specific list of goods and services over time. The list is based in the detailed study of consumer spending of a typical SA household if it revised approximately every 5 years, right? Macroeconomic policy then, the larger increase in unemployment and larger decline in output are severe problem. We often don't like recession. Higher levels of unemployment matters to citizens on average, whether they are unemployed themselves or not. This suggests that much of macroeconomic policy should be oriented to keep unemployment as low as possible. Where remember that Philip Keff suggests that one constraint on policymakers, when unemployment rate is too low, inflation tends to increase. South Africa Reserve Bank seems to care about inflation and whether inflation gets either too high or too low. Much of macroeconomic policy is dominated by 3 goals. One, to keep unemployment from being too high. 2, to keep inflation from becoming a problem. And 3, to create conditions where output per person grow in the long run. So those are we call macroeconomic fundamentals, right? What next? So of course I know that you starting to study economics, and I hope that this introduction was good enough and you will be able to do more, right? So I hope that you read more and you try to learn more. So thank you very much for watching this, and I hope that you have learned something, and see you in the next video.